Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to see you all here. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia, and want to welcome you to Awakening Our Democracy, Free Speech on Campus, and also want to welcome you who are watching on the live stream. Awakening Our Democracy is Columbia's conversational series that focuses on disparities, justice, and pressing issues of our time. And we gratefully acknowledge the co-sponsoring student organizations and the many centers and institutes across the university that support these conversations, which really are all about hearing multiple perspectives on pressing and important issues. And certainly today's is one, the issue of free speech on campus. It really couldn't be more timely, both on our own campus and across the country. It's hard to pick up a media source, whether you actually pick up a newspaper or just click through online, and not see a discussion or a debate about these issues. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, but what I want to do first is actually share some questions that many of you submitted through your registration for this event. And with those questions, I want to say this: we have so much to talk about, both today and beyond. We won't get to every question today, but please consider today one in a series of conversations and opportunities around the university to keep part of this conversation on these issues. And I should add that I did not ask, none of our panelists here are specialists in Columbia's policy. The issues today will be broader than that, and there will be other opportunities to discuss that going forward. So here are some of the questions that you have asked, and I know that our discussion will get to some, but not all again. What is the line between free speech and hate speech? When does speech become dangerous? What has caused the state of discourse on college campuses today? How can we address intolerance and contentious speakers? What can we do about student leaders being targeted or attacked for bringing speakers to campus? How can we better understand the principles of the First Amendment here? Why is it okay to punish or sanction students for shouting down speakers? How much speech can Columbia, and I'll generalize this, any college or university allow without permitting hate speech to plague its community? So there's a lot to discuss, and in some ways that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel who will help us discuss this. Let's see, I will start from that side with my colleague and friend Tanya Hernandez, who joins us from Fordham Law School, where she is the Associate Director of the Center on Race, Law, and Justice and the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law. Professor Hernandez's focus is discrimination, critical race theory, and the science of implicit bias. And her next book, which is coming out in 2018, is Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination, coming out from NYU Press. Next to Tanya is Suzanne Nossel, who is the Executive Director of PEN America, an organization focused on free expression and human rights. You can read PEN's recent And Campus for All, Diversity, Inclusion, and Free Speech at U.S. Universities. So I'm sure you can get it on PEN's website. You can also get it on the Columbia University Life website at the link for this session today. Suzanne previously led Amnesty International and was a senior staff member at Human Rights Watch. And next to Suzanne is my colleague at Columbia Law School, Jamal Greene, who is the Dwight Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. He is one of the nation's leading constitutional law scholars and a widely admired teacher, and has special expertise in First Amendment as well as many other areas. I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Jami Floyd, who is the host of WNYC's All Things Considered. Jami has worked as an award-winning reporter, correspondent, news anchor, and in many more roles at ABC News and many other news outlets, and has won many awards along the way for her incisive analysis. And I really want to encourage you after today's discussion to Google each of them, because they have done so much, and it's really worth knowing more about the many ways in which each of them has contributed, and that will give you more context for the conversation today. And now I'll say one last word about format and then turn it over to Jami. We'll start, as we always do, with the discussion among the members of the panel, and then we will open up to questions from the floor. And the way we do this at Awakening Our Democracy events is to group questions and take 3 or 4 questions or comments in a row, just brief ones. And we just always ask that you say your name and your school. We ask that students take the opportunity that we allow students to take the opportunity to ask questions, your name, your school, and a brief question or comment, and then that'll go back to the panelist. And there we go. Let me turn it over to Jami.
Thank you so much. How are you? It's a little tepid. How are you this afternoon? Okay, one more time. How are you this afternoon? Okay, we're working on it. All right. Okay, so this is going to be a conversation, not a panel. Panel, yawn. Conversation, yes. And it will be a dialogue here and then with all of you. So my favorite part of these events is when you participate, so we're going to get to that right away, and we're just going to juice it a bit with the conversation we have up here. And you offered us, as we just heard, your questions when you registered. So, of course, we've talked amongst ourselves, and we have some questions. I mean, my goodness, how can you not know what to talk about in this area of law and public discourse? So we have some ideas about what we'd like to discuss, but we know what you want to discuss. And so we're going to begin with the questions you've offered us. And then when we get to the Q&A, as we've just heard, we're going to ask you to tell us who you are, what school you're affiliated with, and then to ask your questions in groups so we can get to as many of your thoughts, ideas, questions as possible. We're going to try and keep it brief, although I'm not doing that at this moment, and we're going to ask you to do the same so as many of us as can participate can do so. Okay, I think I've said everything I need to say. So let's start with the obvious and first question we heard just now. And I guess I'll start first. I'm just going to go immediately to my left with Professor Greene, Jamal. To what extent should speech be free on campus? Not just this campus, any campus.
Speech should be free. I'm all for free speech. Let me say a couple of things. One is, I think it's important in this kind of conversation to kind of separate out the legal question from sort of what makes good sense and what we think is a sensible, reasonable policy on campuses. So there's a legal question of, well, how far can a university, a public university in particular, limit free speech?
I noticed you separate public and private.
Yeah, I'm separating out public and private because public universities are governed by constitutional standards, whereas private universities are not. So how much they can limit speech and what the bounds are is going to differ between a public and a private university, typically. And there, I mean, we could talk about that at some length, but I think we want to make sure we put that to one side when we're talking about what makes sense in the context of a university environment. So universities are very interesting and kind of special public spaces, right? They are a place where ideas should be and are exchanged in the service of disseminating information and disseminating knowledge and making sure that lots of positions are on the table. At the same time, they're also kind of constrained environments, right? So everyone in this room, more or less, got in here because you have a Columbia ID, right? You weren't picked at random to be part of this community. And so it is a structured space. And so universities really have to try to balance the fact that they're trying to disseminate knowledge, that they're trying to encourage exchange of ideas, with the fact that they have this historic role as being a place where people can say things that are controversial or say things that are are not either not yet or not are no longer accepted by the mainstream, right? So there is a delicate balance universities have to strike so that you don't really think of them in the same way you think as a government, regulating a public park or something is a very different kind of space than a university space.
So then, Suzanne, when does speech become dangerous? Free speech become dangerous?
Well, our law actually deals with that. I mean, we have a standard in this country when speech is incitement to imminent violence. So if you're egging on a group of people to go out and attack someone, that under our law is dangerous speech. It's not protected by the Constitution. We have the most protective standard in the world for speech in that sense, and that we define incitement very narrowly. I think where most of the issues arise is speech that by law we really don't consider dangerous. It's not incitement to imminent violence, but that doesn't mean it can't be harmful. Speech that may be insulting, offensive, may victimize someone, or otherwise make this campus environment and community an uncomfortable place for certain students. And that, I think that's where a lot of the controversies arise. In our report, which Suzanne Goldberg referenced, we try to address the competing needs for the campus to be an open, inclusive, and increasingly equal environment for students from all kinds of backgrounds, but also without compromising robust protections for free speech and academic freedom. So we talk about the campus being a safe place physically for everybody, being an open space intellectually, and being a supportive space psychologically. So not downplaying those harms, recognizing speech can cause harm. It's not really sticks or stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me. We know, and it's been documented, that certain speech can cause harm, but we think the answer to that is not suppressing or restricting the speech, but rather having other voices speaking out, the university speaking in its own voice to repudiate speech that is noxious, providing supports to students who may experience those harms, so that you can keep the campus both open and sustain this idea of a community that's welcoming for everybody.
Now, I want us all to start jumping in because I know you want to, but let me get one in to Professor Hernandez, Tanya, and picking up on another of the questions Suzanne presented as she introduced us, which plays right off of the notion of that narrow incitement to violence versus hate speech, or maybe now what we want to call hostile speech. What is the line drawn between hate speech and free speech?
Well, I think what's problematic is that when we talk about these questions in the United States, we tend to view the First Amendment and free speech as completely absolute. And from a legal perspective, that's a mischaracterization of the doctrine. There are lots of exceptions. I was told not to get bogged down in legal details, but I'll simply say, if you want to know more, I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A. So there are lots of exceptions. And so the idea that we can't at least have a question about drawing a line that's a little bit more nuanced than just incitement to violence, but something that actually deals with what I would instead characterize as assaultive racial speech. It's not simply some politically offensive form of speech, for which we have plenty of perspectives on how important it is to hear a varied array of views. Racially assaultive speech doesn't seek to enter into conversation. Racially assaultive speech seeks to shut people down. It seeks to let individuals know that, and groups, that they are not welcome. Right? And so it's no accident that we see a lot of this on college campuses right now, where you would think with a more enlightened, educated population, that there would be a more urbane a set of dialogue. No, instead, we see the ways in which the use of racially assaultive speech is trying to let students of color know, and other unpopular and vulnerable groups, that they really don't belong on campus. And there is a way in which we can make a demarcation, and it's the following way. To not think of the First Amendment in isolation. It's not the only amendment in the Constitution. We also have a 14th Amendment that is concerned with very important issues as well, that is equality. And it seems to me you can't pursue equality if you constantly have a First Amendment that is letting individuals know that they can use it to exclude and encourage others to exclude. I mean, if you want like some perspective on, well, how could we draw the line? I'm not someone who is that innovative and creative. I've borrowed from better minds. So Mari Matsuda has laid out just a three-pronged way to do it. You look to see is the message of racial inferiority. Do you look to see whether the message is directed at a historically oppressed group? And last, you look to see whether the message is persecutory, hateful, and degrading.
And that test is laid out not just for the college campus context,
But more
but
broadly.
writ large. Professor, any reactions?
Well, I guess part of the reaction is again to go back to, one of the, it's one thing to say what is the regime we should have when we're talking about people speaking in public, speaking in a park, speaking on the internet, speaking in some space that is not confined by law in some way. I think it's a separate question to think about how we should think about speech on a college campus. So when we talk about hate speech, right, under U.S. law, if we just think about U.S. law doesn't really regulate hate speech except to the degree that it either counts as incitement or counts as a violent threat. And sort of outside of that category, U.S. law, unlike the law of much of the rest of the world, doesn't regulate hate speech. And so, but as Suzanne says, the reason for that is not because hate speech is not harmful. It's not because insulting someone or degrading them, marginalizing them is not going to harm them in some way. People are harmed by speech all the time, just as they're harmed by physical acts as well. The part of the reason why we don't restrict hate speech in the US is a worry about exactly who decides, right? So who is the decision maker who decides what's on one side of the line or what's on another side of the line? And we worry a lot about the tables being turned in various ways, right? So announcing a standard is one thing, but then how do you actually police it? And you worry about over-policing, and you worry about the effects that has on even speech that doesn't fall within the standard.
Please finish.
And so that worry might be writ much larger in the context of the government regulating what you can say in the park or what you can say on the internet than it might necessarily be on a college campus, right? Where speech is regulated from the start, right? We know that there are going to be regulators. There are regulators as to who's admitted, what you can say in a classroom, who gets to be a student group, and so forth, right? There's already a set of rules that apply, and so that concern might be thought about differently on college than it might be as a general rule.
Please go right ahead.
Jump in right
I'm looking. I want to let you know that I am looking at my phone, not checking my texts and my emails. I'm actually looking at your questions that you submitted, and I was going to launch into one, but please go right ahead.
Oh, I just want a little add-on.
Excellent.
The idea of the United States being very exceptional, there's a global consensus that hate speech is problematic and should be regulated. But even the United States is not completely just falling along the incitement to violence line. If we also take into account not just the constitutional restrictions, but also statutory, the Housing Act doesn't let you just put out any advertisement for an apartment that you want to. We regulate you. We say you can't say that you only want white heterosexual men as roommates to rent your apartment to. That's against the law in the United States. Similarly, in the employment context, Title VII, right? You can't racially or sexually harass someone, and we look to see whether or not the words that have been used in the workplace furthered that racial or sexual harassment. So I would just point out that it's a little more nuanced. We're still exceptional compared to the rest of the globe, but we do have room in places where we do think about hate speech, and I only query why we don't look at it further.
And Suzanne, let me ask you whether you think that the college campus is an appropriate microcosm for the larger society. In other words, aren't we trying to do, or are we, not my opinion, are we trying to do different things on a college campus, private or public, than we can expect, or we would hope, but then we can expect to be happening in the larger society? In other words, we're cultivating conversation and discourse. We would hope that students can come together, even with conflicting opinions, and perhaps listen to one another in a way that maybe people don't want to do once they graduate, if they graduate. And that we can, the state can regulate behavior outside the college campus, but inside the college campus, or on the college campus, we ask students to engage in a certain level of discourse and dialogue. And they come here, we would think, or to any college campus, wanting to do that, or is
Yeah, no, I think
not?
I think it's absolutely right that there are certain norms and there's a culture that governs on campus that is unique and distinctive. But it includes a series of different elements. I mean, there is, this idea that you're a community and there's a level of respect and civility and how you treat others. But there's also this idea of, robust intellectual openness and the notion that you'll be engaging with ideas that, may be objectionable to you, confrontational, provocative, and that, as you go on in life and you move to a homogenous suburb, you may never again have to engage those ideas. And I think that the clash comes in, where those elements are in tension, and we've seen it worsen over the last year. I mean, hate speech in this country is become a more robust debate because, in my view, partly because we have had, whereas our laws are less restrictive than, I don't think it's the whole world necessarily, but certainly than many parts, than all of Europe and many of our other allies like Canada or Australia have more restrictive laws, but here we've had stronger taboos in place than in many of those countries. You could publish cartoons in Europe, for example, that really people were not publishing here. I mean, the political cartoonists kind of rue this because they feel like political cartooning in this country, is kind of a dying art because, we are very sensitive. We're a diverse culture, and we, are very proud of that. And there have been strong norms of respect, and I think that's eroded. And there has been a kind of licensing of hate speech from the highest levels of our government, and those taboos are being strained. And that's why I think this conversation is happening. The question is, and I think we have to continue to debate it, whether regulation is the answer. But I think another piece of it should be, how can we shore up our cultural taboos against this kind of speech?
It's precisely one of the questions one of our participants, one of our registrants has asked. Why do you think people are now so against hearing arguments they disagree with, even if it goes against their core values or is offensive? Isn't the whole point of free speech to actually let the weight of reason and logic win the day?
Well, I think there's a certain point at which you have to ask, what is political discourse? What is political speech? It seems to me that we've evolved at least to the point where it is a universal standard that we do not interrogate the humanity of people based on their racial background or their gender, etc. Right? And if that is, and I believe it is, that's not a rhetorical here, then what value is there in trying to continually question the humanity of people based on their racial background and other vulnerable status? And if it has no political value, then why do we continue to tolerate its erosion of equality and racial equality in our country?
I want to just jump in a little bit. I think this connects to this question about tolerance, which is there's a kind of dialectical relationship between how much we worry about what someone is saying and how much power they have, right? So this gets into issues of employment discrimination and housing discrimination. If you're a racist and you're using your racism to deny people housing or to not deny them work, we worry about that much more than if you're sort of sitting in your basement spouting whatever you're going to spout. As technology has changed, there are the kinds of intermediaries that we used to have between ordinary speakers, ordinary citizens, lay people, and positions of power and influence have changed quite a bit. So that if I could put out a tweet that if it gets liked by the right number of people can reach tens of thousands of people very, very quickly. In a way that was simply impossible many years ago, so that a speaker who is engaged in hostile, racist, hate speech potentially has more power than they did in the past. And so part of that, I think part of the reaction and part of the lack of tolerance is a fear, I think, of the ability of hateful dialogue, hateful discourse to metastasize in a way that wasn't really possible without instruments of state power in the past. And this is the challenge of our time, is to figure out how to reconcile that fact with the fact that we also think that tolerance is valuable, that we also think that we should speak to each other and listen to each other and engage in discourse. And there are no easy answers to that question.
Right. I mean, the problem is not just for hate speech, which can propagate so quickly. It's for all kinds of speech that can provoke a reaction that is explosive. And people who are putting out ideas, whether it's feminists or advocates for racial justice or scientists talking about climate change, a whole range of things can provoke a corresponding attack that is so intense and vicious and overwhelming that it silences speech. Now, those people who are piling on with their nasty tweets, that's free speech. They have a right to say it, but it's speech against speech. And I think one thing we're recognizing is that speech can silence speech. And I think it's also a point when it comes to hate speech. I mean, if you're in an environment where you really feel voicing your views or advocating for your group is going to provoke an onslaught, do you have free speech when you know that's going to be the reaction?
I want to ask you more about the power of the internet and the role of it in all of this. Roger Stone was kicked off of Twitter this week for his ugly tweets, which cannot, we're live streaming. There's no FCC. I could actually read the tweet, but I won't. And he wants to sue Twitter because he says his free speech rules were violated, but actually they weren't, because you have no free speech rights on Twitter. It's a private company, and they can, this is my view, they can, as a lawyer, they can shut you down. And I think this may seem obvious, but I'm going to actually take a moment to read us the First Amendment. Because people think, my son says to me, I have a right to free speech. And I say to him, what do I say to him?
Not in my house, you don't.
That's right. You have no right to free speech. Why? Because Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging freedom of the speech or of the press or the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Congress. And then the Supreme Court has interpreted that to include the several states. There's nothing about Twitter. There's nothing about your mama. All right? So when people start stomping their feet about everywhere else where you have free speech, you have to think about where your free speech rights apply. I think you disagree?
No, of course that's right. But I would say this. I mean, we just did a big report on fraudulent news and the risk that it poses to open discourse. And with fake news, it's not really a First Amendment issue. I mean, you can publish lies and falsehoods. The First Amendment, Congress can make no law to deprive you of your right to do that. I mean, there are some exceptions in terms of deceptive advertising, and there's certain commercial speech that is regulated. But, overall, nonetheless, though, I think, our view is that the First Amendment is aiming to protect open discourse, and that if you believe in open discourse, that requires not simply subscribing to the tenets of the First Amendment, but also taking into account a whole range of other considerations, and what's necessary to foster an open environment.
Can I jump in on this as well? And just to maybe push back a little bit on this point, so the First Amendment does say Congress, but the First Amendment, no one disputes that it applies to the president, it applies to states, it applies to judges who are not allowed to violate the First Amendment in terms of finding contempt of court, for example. So it's already been read beyond the text, right? And so then the question becomes, well, how far can you read it beyond the text? So if I have a dispute with Twitter over its privacy policy, or if I have a dispute with Twitter over its speech policy, and I take that dispute to a court, and then that court makes a decision interpreting the contract that I have with Twitter, can it interpret the contract in a way that stifles my speech? Well, that's a government actor, the judge. And so when we get into questions of really people with major power who are trying to get their rights ultimately enforced by a court, the state is always involved in some way, right? So in some way, it's just pointing at Congress and the text of the First Amendment, sort of classically, the text only gets us so far.
Well, when we're on the U.S. Supreme Court, we'll duke it out on this. But it takes me to this next question that we received. Do you, and I don't know if you want to take it, any of the three of you, all of the three of you, But would you think that Roger Stone, it doesn't name Roger Stone, but it fits with the question, or do you think that hate speech is a category of speech we ought to suppress or that we ought to protect? And if I know where you go with this.
I like that.
Or how would you we've already sort of addressed how you would define hate speech as part of the same question. And can you give some specific examples of speech in this category that might be deserving of protection or suppression? I think, of course, of the Flint-Falwell case. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but maybe each of you want to take a stab at this question.
Well, I mean, I just want to jump in and to be able to clarify that when we say we need to encourage tolerance, and part of the value of allowing hate speech to run rampant is to encourage tolerance and to have that be a skill set on the college campus. What we overlook is that we're not asking everyone to tolerate it in the same way. Meaning, tolerance is a mere abstraction for people who are not targeted by hate speech. But vulnerable groups, racial minorities that are targeted by hate speech, we have an outsized burden to bear in tolerating it. And to what purpose? Again, I would reiterate, it doesn't have any political value. So why should we be teaching people to encourage that form of exchange and to have vulnerable groups bear an outsized responsibility to tolerate when no one else is having to tolerate in that same way. And one other thing I would add is sort of the reason why I think it's important to think about how we regulate. I'm not saying everyone has a piece of tape across their mouth, right? There's nuance. But I'm saying we at least should be asking the question about modes of regulation that we could come to an agreement as being acceptable in our society for this reason. Racism is taught. You do not come out the womb thinking of groups as problematic and beneath you. Right? You are taught this. How are you taught this? Through language. Words matter. Right? Linguistics let us know the ways in which words shape our mode of thinking. Right? It's not inconsequential.
But what do you do, Professor Hernandez, with someone who, with the tension between one person who might find a piece of art hateful and insensitive and truly feels that, and the artist who says, this is satire, this is my expression? What do we do with that?
I would agree that there will be hard cases. And that we will not necessarily always have a clear sense of how we should definitively rule. Right? But I don't think that the hard cases should hold us back from even asking the question. Right? I'll add on to that, and then I will leave some more space. Like for instance, with the issue of selective prosecution, right? The idea of, oh my goodness, if you start regulating hate speech, then people will turn it around and harm the very vulnerable groups who are often targeted by hate speech, right? Selective prosecution is never as much of a concern when we think about, should we have a criminal statute that outlaws murder, right? We think, okay, yes, there's ways in which there's selective prosecution. We've seen with issues of race, in who gets killed, who gets brought, who gets the capital murder punishment. Right? There's all kinds of racial selectivity, but we don't think that means that we should have murder on the books as a way of regulating behavior. We treat selective prosecution as a secondary issue that we can attend to. I say the same thing should be done with regulating hate speech.
I see you ready to jump in.
No, well, I'm curious how you think about
provocation.
No, and I think it's fine to have the conversation. I'm curious how you think about a couple of questions that come to mind for me. I mean, one is there is a debate right now about adopting a definition of anti-Semitism that would include a lot of speech that's critical of Israel and render that speech the basis for a civil rights investigation by the Department of Education. And there's actually a hearing next week in Congress to discuss this bill, which we find very problematic from a free expression perspective. But if you believe that racially assaultive, that we should consider whether and how to regulate racially assaultive speech, I'm curious what you think about a piece of legislation like that.
Well, I mean, this is where I think it's so important to remember that dissent is not necessarily hate speech. Right? Meaning, when I say I'm encouraging us as a populace to open the question about regulating hate speech, it doesn't mean that everything foul that comes out of someone's mouth, I would stick and as the judge of hate speech, call it hate speech. So for instance, the questions that I would be asking about such a statute are, wait a minute, a critique of Israel is not necessarily a castigation of a whole population as with regards to their racial inferiority, right? There could be questions about how do we govern, who's part of the citizenry. You know, those are political questions that I think are very much part of what we think of as appropriate for free speech. Right? To equate any kind of dissent with assault of racial hate speech, that's what we should be putting on the table for questioning, as opposed to thinking having the label means everything gets stuck with the label.
I had a question for you, but do you want to respond to that?
I'll just say I want to, with questions like this, I kind of want to distinguish between what we should think about, how we should think about the Constitution and what the Constitution allows, and whether and to what degree we should actually regulate particular kinds of activity. I'm actually quite sympathetic to the notion that under some circumstances it should be permitted to regulate hate speech. But I think it depends on the level of harm, the certainty of the harm, and sort of pragmatic considerations. Well, whether you actually go out and regulate, and also what the punishment is, right? So are we talking about putting people in jail, or are we talking about not giving them a forum, right? Those are two very different modes of sanction, and we should think about them differently.
A fine.
Yeah, or you know, Texas had a case where they didn't want to put Confederate flags on the license plates, right? That's
right.
not getting your Confederate flag on the Texas license plate is not the same as being put in prison, right? So we should think about those things in different terms. But it's also the case that, you know, people who engage in hate speech, to some degree, what they really want and what they really need is oxygen. And regulating them sometimes can give them more oxygen than you want to, right? So it's not always a good idea to regulate, even if you think that it might be constitutionally permitted. You always want to think about the practical effect of doing so. Is it going to cause a backlash? Is it going to drown out your own message by the fact that you're actually trying to regulate and silence someone else? I think those considerations are also quite important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. We did a seminar last week at UC Berkeley where they've had very tumultuous debates over campus speech, and a series of really provocative speakers invited to campus by very small groups of right-leaning students. And you know, one thing that came up in this conversation was that, you know, basically the more there were efforts to shut down and marginalize these right-wing students, you know, both through these campus speakers, but also, you know, in other ways. I mean, it's a very left-leaning campus, and there aren't many faculty that kind of work with or coach these, you know, are advisors to these student groups. They can't get campus departments to partner with them on events, and you know, they were, you know, quite clear that this is a good part of what motivated them to try to mount this, you know, ill-fated and I think ill-conceived, you know, so-called Free Speech Week with you know, some very provocative speakers and you know, quite speakers that a lot of the students saw as hostile. So I think it is, you know, I think it can, you know, the law of unintended consequences, I think, does or can operate here, and it's just worth thinking through. You know, even though selective prosecution, you know, it may not be a reason not to pursue something. You know, I think thinking through, you know, the experience in Europe has been that these laws very often are used kind of the opposite way that you would expect, you know, and to target minority groups when they engage in speech that, you know, others find offensive. So it's just, you know, there are things worth considering as we debate this.
So many of the questions that we received, I think every question I asked was one of the ones that we received from folks who were in the room or hoped to be in the room, because we were way overbooked, were about hate speech and divisive speech. But the title of this is Awakening Our Democracy, Free Speech on Campus. And so I want to back up a bit or take a broader view before we go to questions in about 5 minutes and talk about the larger issues of discourse, because what you just said, Suzanne, made me think about just dialogue on campus. Take hate speech out of it for a moment, and let's talk about free speech. So let's assume you're on a campus where the predominant view is left-leaning, but there are some right-leaning students, and they feel under siege. Or you're on a campus that's predominantly right-leaning, a Pepperdine, or one of the colleges out in Utah, and some of the left-leaning students feel under siege. What can we be doing and maybe this has always been a problem, but as you point out now, we are in, maybe because of the internet, maybe because of the 2016 election, maybe because of the bots, but we are at a time where the dialogue seems to be breaking down. And in classrooms, professors feel that they can't get that dialogue going. Can each of you address what perhaps we could be doing to keep those lines of communication open? This is less of a legal question and more of one of education. And then we'll hear from folks in the room. Who wants to start?
I'll take a stab at it.
Go ahead. Not an easy one, but
Not an
that's why
easy
we're
one,
here.
and you didn't let us know about it on the
Sorry. Just kind of hit me as
But I mean, I'm in the midst right now of something new I'm doing in the classroom, and so I thought I would share it.
Great,
Maybe people
great.
give me feedback here, and that'll be helpful too. So I teach a class called Critical Race Theory, which looks at the jurisprudence of the theory called Critical Race Theory. And part of what I was seeking to do this semester was to have the students think about these issues not just intellectually, because I think this is part of the problem when you're trying to create a real conversation and a level of interaction, is that people get in their debate mode, right? They went to moot court in undergrad, and they learn that I say this, then you say that, and it's all about the head. Right? And so what I've done is create space now for interactive exercises for the students to engage not just the head, but the heart, the mind, the soul, whatever you get in touch with outside that head of yours, in order to really be able to then feel like you can connect with someone else. And so that means having experiential learning. People want to know more about it during the Q&A. I'd be happy to tell you about the exercises I've been doing. But I think that's one way of trying to create a real deeper and a real meaningful kind of exchange, is that people recognize one another's humanity beyond their political camps or other levels of division, when you try to just make it more than just about the head and the
experiential learning.
I mean,
Suzanne.
I think, I'll throw out a few things. One is, how students are kind of socialized to the campus. And I think discussions, small group discussions about, for many students, this is the first time they're really confronting a diverse environment, intellectually and ideologically diverse, racially diverse, socioeconomically diverse. And I don't think and our colleges have gotten so much more diverse over even just the last 20 years. I don't think we're doing enough to help students kind of come into that environment and understand how to figure out who they're meeting, where those people might be coming from, what not to assume, what to take into account when you even ask the most basic questions. So I think that's one thing we need to start incorporating into our freshman orientations and all kinds of other programs. I think First Amendment and free speech principles also, many people, you just read the First Amendment. I'm sure there's some people here who are a little surprised to understand exactly what it does and doesn't do. I think a basic grounding in how it works and what the principles are on campus, also things like harassment law and where the limits of speech are. I think there's nothing as valuable as sort of face-to-face conversation. I mean, one thing we've done to sort of take our report around the country and put it into action is trying to foster conversations between student leaders on campuses and free expression experts and social justice leaders and university leadership. And when they sit in a room face-to-face, it's fascinating, and they do understand each other. It's not like they're coming from completely different planets. There is a certain amount of common ground. Nobody's against free speech. Nobody really likes racist speech to run rampant. Nobody's in favor of that. So you sort of begin to see where there is some common ground.
Common ground for sure. Nobody's against
don't
free
buy it?
speech. No, I agree. No one's against free speech. No one.
Not when you just say it like that.
Right,
you know?
right. Seems so obvious.
I mean, one more thing I would just add is that the other ways to reach students in college campuses is that when you said the first year orientation, we at the law school now do an orientation where everyone has a session on issues of implicit bias. How do we learn about issues of racism? How do we have unconscious, culturally infused thoughts about people based on difference? And having people walk into the college campus already having some, level of grammar about implicit bias and awareness of that, I think is really quite instrumental.
Professor Greene, Jamal?
I think all I would, and I agree with all of that. I think all I would add is, I think it's quite important, and this will sound a little bit jarring and maybe controversial, to de-emphasize the language of rights when we're talking about these topics. When you think that someone is denying you a right, then you're suddenly they are your enemy, right? Because they're trying to suggest that you're not a citizen, that you're not a human, that you're not. That you don't count in the relevant way. And so rather than think about who has a right to do this or that, to think about how is it that we persuade each other about our ideas. There are strategies for persuasion that are distinct from just exercising your rights. And I think we don't talk about that enough. How do you reach someone, right? As a parent of many kids, just 3, but if I think that the child is doing something wrong, yelling at them or telling them you're wrong over and over again is not going to work, right? You work with it over time. I don't mean to suggest you should think about your classmates as children, but maybe you should, in the sense that you're trying to educate them, and education is a complex process, right? So that I think more training in how do you actually speak to someone if you want to persuade them of your ideas would be helpful.
That is controversial, but I'm out of time, so so we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay, so it is now time for the Q&A. I want to remind you to please say your name. You're going to stand, because I can't even see your face there. You're going to stand, and you're going to please say your name and tell us what school you're affiliated with, because we have a great variety and diversity of schools in this room. And we're going to take about 3 or 4 of you, depending on how long you go on, at a time. I'm not going to, well, I guess I'm not going to pick. You're standing right there, so take someone who's right there.
Thank you.
Stand, please. Loudly and proudly, tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Prem Tucker. I'm a first year at Columbia College, and I had a question directed towards essentially all of you. So some students on campus argue that speakers such as Mike Cernovich and Tommy Robinson, who were recently invited by the college Republicans, don't truly add to the intellectual dialogue that students desire, that they present points that seem non-debatable and aren't really valid towards a productive discourse. Who are the capable subjects that can determine who can and can't present these arguments?
Okay, thank you. Now, if you have the same question, we've got it. Does anybody have a different question? Okay, stand with the mic, please. And
sorry, I'm kind of short.
Excellent. Now tell
hi.
us your name.
My name is Athena. I'm
Excellent.
a transfer student into the School of GS.
Great.
So essentially I'm a sophomore. So my question is, I guess for the entire panel, Justin Baldoni, he's an actor on, oh goodness, with Gina Davis. I forget the name of the show, it just totally escaped me. But anyhow, he's doing a show, it's called Redefining Masculinity. And I think the idea behind this is that we have groups that are marginalized and that are oppressed, such as women. And so we're redefining the other side of the argument by saying, we recognize you, we understand. This is what we're gonna do about it. At what point, if at any, do you think that this will exist on the other side of the argument? Let's say white supremacy or white privilege. Because I do think it's about education more than anything. And right now it just seems like there's one side that is forced to fight constantly, whereas the other side is not engaging, not educated.
Thank you, Athena. Okay, let's take one more. Those are 2 pretty hardy questions. Not unrelated, I would add. Where's my mic? Hello.
Hi. She gave me the mic.
Okay. It's okay. Okay, tell us your name and your school, please.
My name is Arman. I'm a second year in Columbia College. So my question is specifically for Professor Hernandez. You say that speech like we've seen on campuses from people like Richard Spencer have no political value, that they aren't true political discourse. And I personally do agree, but there are many who don't. I'd argue that it's actually that speech which in part helped elect our current president. So would we not be doing a disservice to the education of future leaders by preventing that very real but still very problematic speech?
So Armand, your question is sort of the flip side. You guys, you gentlemen have sort of the opposite sides of the same coin question, am I correct?
Yeah, pretty much.
Fascinating. We should have a debate. You two should come up here and have, no, I'm just kidding. We're not doing that. We are not, Suzanne, don't kill me. We're not doing that. Okay, so why don't we take those two questions first, and then Athena will finish with yours. Is that okay, Athena? Is that okay? Okay. So how do we want to handle this? Do you want to start with the
I'll respond to the one directed
Armand's
to me.
question?
Sounds good.
And then we can, why don't we just ball those together? Because I kind of think they go together. I knew this was coming up. You people think I'm surprised, but I am not surprised. Okay, so go ahead. I mean, this is basically what we've been talking about. I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in this particular debate. The question is, you know, these kinds of hateful speakers. I mean, is there a point at which they're just so hateful, there's no value to the speech, and a university, this university, should just say no? Or is there some value, as Armand suggests? Not that you're saying there's value, but if some students think there's value, then perhaps they should be permitted to speak. Why don't you give it a shot, and then if anybody else wants to participate. Go for it.
Okay. So, I mean, my remarks were not directed to any particular speaker that's been invited to campus, but, you know, just the issues broadly. But here's what I think as far as, you know, is it important to be able to hear messages that you may view as foul, just so that you know about that those messages exist? And I would say the following. We know that those messages exist. They get an outsized proportion of prominence. They circulate quite widely. We've had over 200 years of hearing these messages. So it's not something new, novel, or unexamined that we need to, you know, put under further scrutiny for better understanding. And so in that way, it seems to me that one unifying consideration to think about is, well, does the speech deepen power disparities amongst groups? Right? You know, that's like an anti-subordination perspective to bring a way to infuse equality principles into the First Amendment. Or does it make it less likely that there might be systemic discrimination and a dismantling of it in the future? Right? I mean, there are ways in which we could conceive of making the decisions and giving parameters to colleges that wanted to think about, you know, when do they allow particular guests or not, or others. And so it seems to me that there's no gap in a college education by not giving prominence to particular speech. And one other thing I would just sort of tag on to that is Professor Greene made mention of this idea of, well, or of what I characterize sort of the idea about racial venting, you know, that it's important to, maybe we should think about the ways in which if we just let some people get it off their chest, then that will be better for society because they'll keep it to words and they won't take it to action. But the social science suggests the opposite, right? That it's the words that gin people up into action. And that putting a higher cost to hate speech actually diminishes the level of hate crime. There was an interesting economic study that at a modeling that examined this. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to pay more particular attention to having the decisions being made by people who are in power to think about captive audiences and what is there to influence them, and whether they want to be complicit in furthering, right, discourse that only teaches more racism.
You're comfortable with the fact that one administration might decide one way and another administration might decide another way?
Well, I mean, that's why I think it's so
The
important.
decider.
Right, I mean, that's why it's
President
important.
Bush.
We're not talking about giving unfettered discretion, right? If we put this for serious consideration onto the table, we could, as a community, come together to kind of think about the ways in which there are workable and common cause, as Suzanne was saying, some things that we do agree on, for ways to give parameters and guidelines to those who are making the decisions based on our community concerns.
Well, I asked a very similar question to, I think, this combined question last week at Berkeley to Professor Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of the Berkeley's Law School, the new dean there, and he's written a book about campus speech. And I sort of said, what about these provocateurs? They're not there for discourse. They, are grandstanding. They want nothing more than to be shut down and to be able to, go to their funders and their supporters and gin up more backing and get into the media. Can we make a distinction between them and other kinds of speakers that are, coming to campus with a different purpose? An example he gave kind of stopped me cold because he said, well, that's what they would have said about Martin Luther King. When he, was beginning to mount the civil rights movement, he was a provocateur. He was trying to make headlines. He was trying to get arrested and goad and push the dialogue forward. And he was using tactics that people called, provocative. He had ideas that were outside the mainstream. And he, they could have used a very similar argument to shut him down, if that kind of argument were something that was credited. So, it's back to this point about whether you trust the deciders. I think it's Jami's question, and whether there's any neutral rule, and we may disagree on this, or whether it's really conceivable to design a rule that would exclude, precisely and only that which we all agree, has no place here, and, not a word or a sentence more, or if the quest for that kind of rule is a Pyrrhic one, that and it's just that rule doesn't exist. So I found his counter kind of jarring.
But isn't that reducing it to provocation, right? As opposed to actually asking about what deepens inequality, right? If you put Martin Luther King under a provocation standard, certainly. But if you ask whether his actions or speeches were about deepening inequality, that man was about love, right? There would be no way that a Chemerinsky or someone else could say that would be problematic under the standard as under the Hernandez rule for
But
hate
Hernandez was not the judge at the time.
No, but I say, let's think about putting the Hernandez rule into effect. Stop.
Did you want to jump in on this, Professor Greene? Before I promise you, Athena, we are coming to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that. I think there is no neutral rule. I think Martin Luther King is an easy case. I think a Holocaust denier is an easy case, but I think most of these people are not in that category. I think most people, I think even provocateurs tend to gussy up what they're saying in sort of pseudo or quasi-academic terms, and it can be very hard to draw these kinds of lines. It doesn't mean that you don't draw them. We live in an imperfect society. We can't expect perfection out of administrators. We can't expect neutrality necessarily out of administrators. I think on a college campus, I mean, I actually have no problem with a college campus, a college administrator saying there are some people who we're just going to deny because of the content of their message. I mean, again, you can give the easy example: someone who denies the Holocaust, if a college group wants to bring him on campus, I don't have a problem with an administrator saying, nope, not that one, right? I mean, I don't think that's the end of the world. I think that we have bigger problems than denying Holocaust deniers. So at some point there's going to be a line, and human beings have to draw them. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings have errors on both sides, and if we all agree that there is a point at which we can say, this is not consistent with the values of our community, you just have to trust your decision makers, right? If you don't like your decision makers, try to change them. But at some point on a college campus, and I think, again, I distinguish this from the government, but on a college campus, I would even say a public college, which is not this, which is my normative view of how the law should be.
Yes.
Even in a public college, I don't make those kind of formalistic distinctions. I would say a college campus is very different than a public square. It's a regulated space, and you know, you have to try to hire good administrators if you're going to make those decisions. And I think at some point you have to make them.
And our topic is free speech on campus.
Yep.
Not free speech writ large. All right, back to Athena's question, and you know, I'm afraid I don't know the show you're talking about, but this idea of redefining the oppressed through redefining the oppressor. So redefining masculinity, perhaps redefining white supremacy. It's an optimistic view, but is it possible? I'm going to ask one of you to take it because I want to get to some more questions. I could just close my eyes and point, but who wants to grab it?
Me? All right, I guess I'm the white person on the panel. There's certain duties, apparently. So, I don't know if I totally understand.
And you're a woman, so you can take either. And look, we're in
Right.
this moment now, right?
Yeah, sure.
We're in this moment with all of these women now coming forward about these horrific stories that have, for decades in some cases, remained untold and trying to take on their oppression in this very public way. So maybe that is a sign of hope and optimism that at least that part of the story is going to be retold.
Yeah, look, it's a very fluid moment. I don't know if I totally understand I don't know much about that show or what that entails to redefine masculinity. I think, you know, if you're asking, you know, will there come a moment where white people in our country, you know, take a more searching look at their role and position and advantages? You know, I think there's some people that do that. You know, are we ever going to see that, you know, take hold nationwide? I mean, I would say here's where my hope lies, which is sort of in the next generation, and particularly people growing up in, you know, more diverse societies and environments who are much more cognizant. You know, for example, I'll take, you know, like, you know, my kids until recently, they only knew a black president. You know, that was the only president they knew. You know, that's what a president looked like. And I think that, you know, I think that has an effect. I think growing up in an environment where gay marriage is the law of the land has an effect, and how kids look at different kinds of families. So, you know, I think in that sense there is hope, and you know, and the debates that we're having permeate, and so I think there is hope for that kind of searching re-examination. Will it reach every corner of our society? Will there be, you know, no. Will there be recalcitrance? Yes.
Do people give up power willingly? Usually not. Okay, let's take some more questions. Let's take two, I think, at least to start. Let's see how it goes. Okay, microphone back there, Stan. Tell us your name.
Hey, my name's
Hey.
Tim.
Hi, Tim.
I'm from the School of Engineering.
Great.
And my question is basically on the effect of free speech on campus and how that affects the world outside of campus. If I'm talking to my grandfather what all college is going, his first question is, so what about all these snowflakes, you know, not listening to you and, you know, whatever, not listening, not to me, but to the people he listens to. The controversial campus, controversial figures coming to campus has become such a meme. It's become such a touch point for people outside of college campuses that's the only thing I think a lot of them think about now, is that colleges are places of rejection of these things. And I wonder, as much as we're trying to create a space where people can learn and people can, we can move the world forward, how do we balance our place in the world as havens of intellect and reason, and at the same time possibly rejecting speakers of any kind.
Thank you, Tim. Please, sir.
Hi, everyone. My name is Qayyum Ahmed. I'm a PhD student at Teachers College. I'm also one of the students who.
My mother graduated from Teachers
wonderful.
College. Excellent. I'll tell her we met. Go right ahead.
I'm also one of the students who, until recently, was facing disciplinary action by the university for exercising what I believe was my right to free speech against the white supremacists who were invited onto campus by the college Republicans. And I was curious as to the conversations that we've been having on campus about this issue. The college Republicans use the free speech provisions in the Constitution as a way of justifying their right to bring white supremacists onto campus. And then the university also uses free speech provisions to suppress, in my opinion, students who then want to protest those actions by the college Republicans. And so the burden then, as Professor Hernandez correctly points out, falls on us as people of color to try and fight the university and the college Republicans and the white supremacists who are clearly dominating the narrative and the rhetoric at the moment. So I was curious as to whether you had any advice for the Executive Vice President Goldberg on how best to support students so that we are not the ones having to fight everyone, the white supremacists, the college Republicans, and the institution, when we as black and brown students on this campus need to be supported and need to be protected. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. Okay, let's take one more, and we will come back to that. I don't want to spend the entire afternoon talking about this one. We don't want to allow this man who has dominated your fall to dominate this session. But we will come back to that again.
I actually, I'm sorry, my name is Lauren. I'm from the School of the Arts.
Did you say Lauren?
Lauren, yes. I'm from the School of the Arts.
What kind of artist are you?
Theater.
You're theater, excellent.
My question is actually around the definition of hate speech. It seems to me that a lot of the...
I wasn't sure we gave you a definition.
Yeah, I realized that around, I see the issue around whether we regulate it, whether we not regulate it, a real question and a fear around defining what hate speech is.
Yes.
My own take is like pornography, you know it when you see it, but I wanted to, my question was, is there a legal definition of hate speech on the books? Not a law expert by any stretch of the imagination. And does it seem to, and if not, if we were to try to define it as a step toward getting some sort of regulation, some sort of framework around it, would it fall on the speaker, or would it be defined by the speaker but defined by the listener? Because in this discussion, you all sort of spoke about it in both ways. And then what is the role of colleges and universities to inform their student body on the definition of hate speech and whether it matters, whether intent matters, or how it's heard?
Two-part question.
You can just take the first.
I'm just kidding. Okay.
We just have one more who's been patient.
Okay, I have 5 minutes left, but I guess we'll cheat a little bit. Go ahead and take one more. Go
Hi,
ahead.
my name is Lorraine, and I'm also a first year here at Columbia College. And
Okay,
my
Lorraine.
question is more about the reaction to hate speech. So we all know like Columbia students really love protests and everything. So do you guys think protesting is an effective way of expressing the views of like the group, or does it actually bring more attention to the speaker than that he deserves?
I'm glad you asked that because we actually got that question in the questions that came in, and I kept going to it and wanting to ask it, and then we got derailed from it, so I had intended to ask it. Thank you, Lorraine, for asking that question. And maybe we'll come back to it in the context of, is your name Kayun? Where is he? Is it Kayun? Okay, so we'll get back to your question, Kayun, and I'll ask about protests there. But first, let me come to Lauren's question. I'm going to come right here to Professor Greene. So, hate speech. Why are you looking at me like that? You're ready. You're ready. Okay. All right. So, you know, there are hate crimes, but we're not talking about that. So, hate speech, definition?
So I think of hate speech as kind of like collusion, right? It's collusion. It's not really, in the United States, it's not really a legal term. I mean, there are institutions that have their own policies and private institutions that have their own policies as to what counts as hate speech. And the U.S., various U.S. states used to regulate hate speech. So as late as the 1950s, there were so-called group libel statutes on the books. So if you called people into disrepute on the basis of their race, or it wouldn't have been gender then, but on the basis of their racial identity, that could count as what's called as a group libel. You're kind of defaming people as a group. But as a legal matter, the U.S. government, again, unless there's an action associated with it, like discrimination, or unless there's immediate and likely incitement to violence, unless it's something called fighting words in theory, so you're really getting up in someone's face, then it's really just something for private institutions to develop on their own, and there are a variety of ways you can define it.
And there are some jurisdictions that have very controversial hate crimes, where if you can tie violence to hateful thought or speech, then they will prosecute you for the hate crime. But that's beyond really what you're asking about. But we can talk about that a little bit afterwards.
Although
Now,
one thing to add, though, right, is that there's
Go.
an international definition of it.
Go ahead.
The Convention on the Elimination of Racism and Discrimination, CERD, has its own definition that many nation states adopt. We don't in the United States, but okay. And so it is based on the idea of disseminating ideas on racial superiority and hatred. So meaning power relations are taken into account, right? It's not just mouthing off. It's about having a particular kind of objective of subordination. And so the global standard from CERD sort of focuses on hate speech messages that are connected to discrimination, to violence, to inferiority, hatred, persecution, right? The very kinds of expression that most interfere with the rights of subordinated group populations. So there's a way to conceive of it.
all of this really difficult and challenging in a country that has had such a powerful First Amendment history, but a First Amendment written by white founders that didn't value African and Native people here in this country, on this soil, as full human beings. So that's a tension, a real tension in our country. A tension, I will say, for me as a lawyer who truly values the First Amendment, but also has Black and Native ancestry. So, you know, it's a difficult and troubling question to grapple with. So we can talk more about it afterwards, because I got to move it along. Okay, and to the very difficult question, you know, I see you there. I see you looking at me. Okay, so we've already talked about this now once with the two-sided coin that our friends raised earlier, but you put it very neatly into the First Amendment question. The First Amendment being raised by those of you who wanted to protest the speaker, and then the First Amendment raised by those who brought the speaker. So I have three academics here on the stage. How do we deal with that? I mean, the First Amendment is there for all of us, right? I said earlier, listen, don't use this First Amendment. You're not really entitled to use the First Amendment, but you say the spirit of the First Amendment is really present on a campus. So let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment for students. And you know, again, not getting too bogged down in this one case, but this is a good way to kind of wrap up, and then I want to finish with protest. How can a university support its students within the spirit of the First Amendment? Can each of you, maybe in just a few seconds, address that?
So I'll just go back to the notion that I don't think of this as quite a First Amendment issue, right? I think of it as First Amendment values, as you suggest, Jamie, are relevant here. Universities have a responsibility to promote First Amendment values, and they wouldn't be doing their job if they're not letting people engage in discourse. But it's a regulated environment, and the job of the university, and without having any particular opinion about Columbia's policies, but the job of the university is to create a regulated space. And if that means that sometimes speakers don't get invited, or certain kinds of speakers aren't going to get invited, that might be a cost of doing that you have to tolerate. And if that means that sometimes protesters are not going to be able to protest in the ways in which they want to, that's also a cost that being in a regulated environment has to be tolerated. And how to actually balance those things in any individual case is going to be hard. But it's not, to me, it's not quite the same as a free speech question.
That's an excellent I think that's a great ending, but if either of you want to add, please.
Well, just quickly, I think you're raising the question of counter speech and, efforts to suppress counter speech. And my view is when counter speech comes to the point of shutting down the speech and making it impossible for the listeners to hear the speech, it's gone too far. And there are a lot of effective ways of protesting powerfully that stop short of that. And I think that's one of the things I'd love to see students be educated on. I do think, your second part of your question about how can the university support students who feel targeted by this speech, that the campus may have reasons to allow these speakers to come, but there are a whole series of steps that I think can be looked at for how to make students feel more supported. Statements by the administration about their own values, dialogue with those students about what would be helpful to them, psychosocial support, inviting other speakers who could be inspiring and rallying, from the other side. So I think there's plenty to look at to kind of mute and blunt the effect of some speech that, may have a reason to be there, or we may not want to shut down, but that nonetheless can be harmful.
And I endorse all of that. And the one thing I would just close with is that what we would hope all our college administrators would be attentive to is looking at the First Amendment as not becoming an instrument of domination, but instead of liberation.
And the last thing I want to ask you, and my time is up, I got a little smiley face here. Lorraine asked a very good question about protest. Is that the best tool? I think you were just addressing this, Suzanne. Is that students love to protest? Of course, we mentioned Dr. King earlier, who used protest to great effect. But is it the best tool when one disagrees with a speaker? Or are there better tools for students to use? Quickly, Professor.
My brief intervention would be to say that the question about protest as whether or not it's the most effective method should be considered in light of what other true outlets are there for counter speech. And I think that the reason why there's so much use of protest is because students don't often feel like they have an outlet for true counter speech that will have the same effect and reach that dominant racial views tend to have.
And Suzanne, I guess you have to have an outcome that you desire for your protest.
Yeah, I'd say often the worst thing is to shut down the speech. And I think we've seen that time and again. The thing that emboldens, the thing that's made Milo Yiannopoulos a celebrity is being shut down. And that's when they can grandstand and say, they're being denied their rights and, they need money in their coffers and airtime. So I think often that can play exactly the opposite way. I think protest can be very effective, and there are all kinds of creative techniques of protest that can turn the camera lights away from the person up at the podium and onto the protesters.
And our panel was Awakening Democracy, Free Speech on Campus. Professor Jamal Greene, you want to give us a closing thought?
All I'd say is I think the answer, and this is consistent with what I've said throughout the panel, is the answer is sometimes. Academic.
Thanks to all three of our wonderful and courageous, I have to say, panelists for your conversation. And to all of you.
And I'm going to ask you to join me in just a moment in thanking our incredible panel for really a thought-provoking conversation. And in the Office of University Life, I want to say first, we will have more opportunities to continue this conversation. There are more opportunities, I know, through events being put on by student organizations and so forth. I want to mention two quickly, though. I think we have some comment cards in the back of the room over there if you want to turn around. And if you want to grab one and write anything just quickly now, quick reactions, we would be very happy to have them as ideas for more conversations or anything else you'd like to share. I wanted to note, you may see on some people in the audience and around campus these #UnitedCU buttons. Part of the challenge, and I think this has come up, is at a university where there are speakers speaking who are in conflict with the university values. I think one of you said this, one of the important functions of a university is to state its own values. And under this hashtag, you can find more about this on affirming our community values at universitylife.columbia.edu. You'll see a lot more ways to get involved in this project. You can also find tons about free speech on our campus on the University Life site. I want to mention that Jami Floyd is about to be on the Person, Place, Thing podcast hosted by the former New York Times ethicist Randy Cohen, and you can actually see her live at the JCC Harlem on Wednesday or hear her online. And you will find, we'll send this to you, but you'll find photos and all sorts of things on the University Life website, including we will send you a link to the video of this. And if you enjoyed the conversation, we would just ask that you send it around and share it around on your social media. So with all of that, I really want to thank all of our wonderful panelists and moderators again for a terrific, thought-provoking conversation. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.